everybody. Welcome back to Shannon's Lumber Industry Update. This is episode 54, and I'm calling this one Stretching Wood. More importantly, how do we stretch the use of this raw material that we work with every single day? I actually had a question from Zach that kind of spawned this episode. And he says, how do we make our lumber go further? And what efficiencies have been lost or forgotten in the modern processes? So I thought this would be kind of a good main topic for the show, but I also really want to throw this out to you guys and hear about how you take this limited resource that we have, whether it be limited just because there's only so much growing or limited because lumber is expensive, especially these days. And how do you stretch your lumber dollar further? Or have you invented the infamous board stretcher? So anyway, that's kind of our main topic, but I do want to take a second just to, again, thank everybody who sponsors and supports the show. Patreon.com/lumberupdate is where you can go to support the show. Got a bunch of new sponsors in the last couple of months, and I just sincerely appreciate kind of the vote of confidence that you guys give me every time you sponsor the show, and everyone who continues to sponsor the show. It means a great deal to me. So thank you, as always. Let's jump into a little bit of industry news. Jason sent me this really cool article on printing wood. Certainly 3D printing has become like the rage. Everybody talks about 3D printing, and really the ability to 3D print in different materials is becoming more and more common, just starting with the right raw material. And here's something where somebody is starting with wood flour, essentially, kind of the same stuff that like composite decking is made out of. That central core is wood flour, and being able to print with wood flour to create actual wood. But what's crazy is the layering that we get when we 3D print can actually be done in such a way to simulate wood grain. So I'm going to post a link to this article, and I highly recommend you check it out. If for nothing else, just looking at the imagery, because in my mind, I was thinking, wood flour used to print wood, it's just kind of look like really fine particle board or look like MDF or something. But it is absolutely crazy how they have created some objects that look like purple art or look like satin wood. You can actually see wood grain. In some ways, this reminds me of, I'm not going to remember what it's called. It was really big in turning circles where they took a bunch of different colored wood, dyed woods, and kind of stack laminated them together. And you had this kind of crazy, funky neon turned thing. This is similar, but it just looks natural. So it's pretty cool. And ironically, the company that is kind of spearheading this is called Desktop Metal. They kind of cut their teeth in printing using metals. But now, upcycled wood made with the binder jetting technology that they have is created 3D printed wood. So you want to talk about stretching your wood further? Imagine being able to take the dust from your dust collector, dumping it into like the hopper of your 3D printer and printing your next part. That is stretching your wood further. Very cool. So thank you, Jason, for that article. This is one, this may not be news to a lot of folks, but you know how Netflix, or for that matter, Amazon, and especially Facebook, like what you see in your timeline, like it can't be duplicated. You'll see it once, you'll never find it again. And just the other day, the show called Big Timber popped up on Netflix, and it says it was released in 2020. So wow, that's only just last year. I've never seen it until now, and I got to say, I am loving this show. I'm only 4 episodes into the first and only season that exists right now, but it is particularly interesting because I get a lot of questions about, especially now, why is lumber so expensive? Watch this show. Granted, it's a reality show, and I'm sure there's more drama added than is necessary, but you cannot hide the fact that this guy who runs a logging company up in British Columbia is absolutely working his butt off and coming up with creative solutions in order to get logs out of his claim, down to his sawmill, down to his customer sawmills, working with a total skeleton crew with, vintage machinery that's constantly being rebuilt and tied together with chewing gum and twine. It is truly amazing the stuff that they do to get these logs off to a mill to be turned into wood. And they're just doing one species, particularly Western red cedar. It is truly amazing the volume of work that's going in. And this is the stuff that where I work at a lumberyard that doesn't have, well, we do have a sawmill, but not a production sawmill. So when the wood comes to us, it's already in board form. This is all upstream of where I work. And it just really crystallizes how much work goes into all of the wood that you see on the shelf, all of the wood that you're trying to buy, the decking you're trying to buy, the siding you're trying to buy, the windows and doors you're trying to buy. There is an immense amount of labor and time upstream in the supply chain. So you can imagine why lumber costs began to skyrocket when the labor was cut in half due to COVID, when there was no way to get the logs or the boards from point A to point B. And there's a particular spot, I want to say it's early on in the first season, like maybe episode 2 or something, where a bridge is actually shut down, or it's actually downgraded on the weight that it can carry. And it prevents this guy from moving any logs from his claim back to his mill. And it's like 3 weeks he's shut down. 3 weeks is nothing. You think about the 18 odd months that COVID shut down transportation and what that could actually do to this tiny little business up in British Columbia. It's just really interesting. I'm sure it's no accident that they released this show when they did, but anyway, if you work with wood, you're going to find this fascinating. So check out Big Timber on Netflix. I'm absolutely loving the show. It's fantastic. A little bit of feedback here. Michael wrote in, and I love this. He says, why did consummate lumber pro Shannon Rogers make the Instagram floozy mistake of referring to the Yakasugi process as the mistranslation Shushugiban? The latter isn't a Japanese term, just a popular misnomer for I have a torch. I'd expect that sort of lumber terminology mistake from some guy named Mark, but not you. Very funny. Mark, if you're listening, he spelled your name wrong. So you have yet another bone to pick with Michael. I'll send you his email address. You can take it up with him. Instagram floozy, huh? I kind of like that. I'm gonna add that into all of my social media profiles. Lumber, wood nerd, Instagram floozy. And, Michael, honestly, I did not know that translation of Shushugiban. It is interesting. You will find Yakasugi and Shushugiban used interchangeably all over the place. And it's one of those things where it may not be correct, but Yakasugi actually has less traction, if you will, on a torch product than Shushugiban. So I've actually referred to the process as Yakasugi with many of my clients, and they don't know what I'm talking about. You say Shushugiban and they go, oh yeah, absolutely. Occasionally you can say torched and they'll know what it is, but the majority of people refer to that burning process as Shushugiban. So whether it's right or whether it's not, that's what the market knows it to be. So yeah, I'm not going to claim that I knew that I didn't make this mistake. I did it on purpose. I didn't. It was an honest mistake. But at the same time, you got to pay attention to what the market's calling it. In the SEO terms, even if that keyword that you're optimizing for is spelled wrong, you might want to optimize for it because there's a lot of people using it. So there we go. We learned something new today, at least according to Michael. We're trusting that Michael is right. But if you ever walk into a Japanese bar and you say, I have a torch, well, now you know how to say Shushugiban. So Brian has some feedback from the modified wood episode I did last time. He says there are a couple of cool uses for modified lumber in the luthier world. First, torrefied spruce is used for soundboards to pre-age them. Second, there is a wood, I believe it's Purple Heart, that is modified to turn it black to use as an ebony replacement. I think it's marketed as Royal Blackwood. Very cool stuff. Thanks for the podcast. I love listening while I paint houses and dream of woodworking. Very nice. I guess that is one job where you can truly zone out and just move the paintbrush. Up, down, not side to side. That was my worst Mr. Miyagi impression. So anyway, this is interesting. And I always find that kind of the creative uses for things like modified woods, it always seems to be in the luthier world. Those guys really understand the technical properties of wood and understanding of tone woods and how it changes an instrument entirely, the character of an instrument entirely. It's pretty interesting. And I love the idea of pre-aging a soundboard because, of course, spruce is used as a great tone wood. It's used for a lot of soundboards, but to pre-age it by using torrefied spruce is absolutely brilliant. So major kudos to all the luthiers out there. If you want to talk to a real wood nerd, don't listen to this show. Go talk to a luthier. They are the man when it comes to this stuff. Next, I got a comment over on Instagram from James, and he was referring to the episode I did about the embargo on teak and how Iroko, at least in my mind, is the obvious alternative and how it's a little slow to be adopted in North America. And I thought this was an interesting perspective from across the pond. He says, I just listened to the episode on teak. I'm lying in my Iroko frame sunroom in the west of Ireland right now. Iroko has been a direct replacement for teak here for years, at least 15 years. If you ask for teak, you get Iroko. Traditionally used here as an outdoor wood for windows and doors, it is an interchangeable term, much like mahogany and sapele. If we ask for mahogany, we get sapele. Very interesting, James, and I'm glad that you wrote in and said this, because this was actually something that my lumber buyer has been very aware of, because we actually, a lot of the companies that we buy, like our African timber and from, they're all European companies. I mean, if you think about it, the Dutch East India Company was the first company really pulling material out of Africa. The Netherlands as a country, France, Germany, Belgium, they have been major exporters of lumber from Africa for centuries. So they are kind of quick to identify some of these other species and have been pushing them in the market for quite a long time. Plus, North America is such a massive, monstrous consumer of all these products that, you know, the really readily available commercial products tend to go across the pond to North America. And unfortunately, Europe's kind of left with the secondary loads. And they've been forced to adopt different species for quite some time. Plus, in many ways, it's actually a lot easier for them to get African woods just one continent up rather than across an ocean. So they're finding all kinds of secondary and tertiary species, or at least secondary and tertiary to us in North America, have ended up becoming primary species in Europe. And it's laudable, I would say, with the easy adoption that Europeans have with a lot of different newer wood species. And for that matter, modified and engineered woods, super popular over there and have been for decades that no one has heard of here in North America. So here again, I applaud all you guys over there in Europe for being more adaptable. We North Americans, call it what it is, we Americans tend to be a lot more stubborn about the stuff we can accept. And it's one of our fun little ethnocentric oddities. I'm just going to leave it at that. So again, thank you. Great feedback. And I'm glad to hear that Iroko is essentially interchangeable with teak, because it should be. It's a really close alternative to it. So moving on to a few questions. This was interesting. It came in from Mike, and he said, I rarely hear you mention woods like kumru and ipe for exterior use. Is there a reason? Weight and hardness, I'm sure, factor into the decision, as they can be difficult to work, but are they still worth a mention? He goes on to say that he made a bathtub tray out of ipe. He's planning on making some pool loungers out of kumru this summer, as soon as he can get the boards from his dealer. So, you know, am I missing anything, or do most woodworkers just shy away from insanely hard species? And it was really interesting when I read this, and I had to kind of think back about, do I really not mention ipe and kumru? And I wonder if that's just me trying to put forward a non-biased front, because the company I work for, we have like several million board feet of ipe and several million more board feet of kumru. It's one of our major products. As basically any lumber mill in North America selling in the commercial trade, tropical decking is a massive trade. So we just had 27 shipping containers of ipe come in the last couple of weeks. We deal with kumru all the time. In fact, New Yorkers, if you go to Little Island out there at Pier 54, all those railings, those kumru railings around the amphitheater, those were made by my company. Those were kumru timbers that were imported in, dead green, and we had to mill them into those cool railings around the amphitheater. So kumru and ipe, absolutely, they are worth a mention as an exterior. It's kind of interesting that I didn't mention them. As I said, maybe I'm trying to not tilt this towards the company I work for, but no doubt they are probably, ipe I still consider to be the king of decking woods. It's a nearly isotropic species. Its TR ratio is like 1.1. It is super hard at over 3,800 pounds per square inch Janka. Kumru is just below that in hardness. now I'm forgetting the number offhand. I think it's like 32 or 3,300. Ridiculously hard. Kumru may not be quite as stable as Ipe in that the TR ratio is a little bit higher or farther apart than Ipe, but it is still a phenomenal species. And there are kind of subspecies in yellow and red Kumru that can give you slightly different looks. I don't know that woodworkers are shying away from it. Those that have worked with it once come away going, man, that stuff's like concrete. And it can be really, really difficult to work. As a primarily hand tool guy, I don't use the stuff. It is just too difficult to work by hand. I have worked with it with my machine several times before. It absolutely eats planer blades. So you must be using carbide blades, carbide cutters in your planer and your joiner, because it will destroy your high-speed steel blades in a second. And that would be probably the one thing that maybe if woodworkers are shying away from it is that reason. But the other thing is both Ipe and Kumru are primarily tropical decking woods. It is very rare to find them as a rough sawn board. They are already an S4S E4E surface on four sides, eased on four edges product. In many instances, it may already be pre-grooved for hidden fasteners. It comes from Brazil as a decking board. You actually have to special order it as a rough sawn board. And there's actually import difficulties and regulations. It comes from getting Ipe and Kumru as a rough sawn board, and Lacey frowns upon it because there's a certain percentage of work that needs to be done in Brazil. And that percentage normally extends to the actual milling, planing, and molding of it into an S4S E4E decking board. So it is very, very rare that you get it as anything other than a decking board. So it can be difficult to get in sizes, certainly thicker than 1 inch, and usually about 5.5 inches wide or 4.5 inches wide or 3.5 inches wide, traditional decking boards. So, if you're building outdoor furniture, that may be just fine, because a lot of times you're building kind of a slatted furniture to allow water to run through. If you're building something that is going to require wider boards, you're going to have to glue it up. Ipe certainly can be glued. It's best to be glued with epoxy. And even then it can be a little bit finicky. We've actually done bent lamination at the mill several times with Ipe. And it took quite a bit of trial and error and some really, really fancy, super expensive epoxy to get it to work properly without massive amounts of springback. So, there are a couple of reasons that Ipe might be not the first choice for a lot of woodworkers. Plus, to be honest, it's expensive, and it's only getting more expensive. This was a species that was massively on the rise in price before COVID hit, then COVID hit, and it's made it even more expensive. And I'm pretty sure I've said this on the show before, but if you're looking for a little prognostication, I'm pretty certain that Ipe is going to become CITES Appendix 2 listed within 5 years. And that is going to make that species even more expensive. So, yeah, it's a fantastic, and I'm referring mostly to Ipe, but I pretty much could throw Kumru in there in the same level. Fantastic exterior wood. You're not going to find much better exterior woods than those two species, but there's a lot of things going against it, and there are several other options for the average woodworker who may be looking to build furniture. So there you go, Mike. That's why I don't talk about Ipe very much, but maybe I should some more, because it's a massive trade in and of itself. So I got a voicemail from Jonathan on Dockwoods that I thought was particularly interesting. Take it away, Jonathan.
Hello, Shannon. Jonathan here from Minnesota. I'm curious about what wood would you use for building a dock? In episode 52, you talked a lot about exterior woods, probably with the idea that they would be made into furniture outside. But I'm curious about usage of wood for building a dock, both substructure and the top dock parts. I'm looking at kind of various things. I could use everything from like a thermally modified ash to just like composite decking of some variety for the top. However, I'm also curious about the substructure. I'm in Minnesota, so it's going to be a freshwater lake, and it will be floated with pontoons or buoys underneath. And it seems like the only option I have is pressure-treated pine available to me that people recommend, but I didn't know if there are any other woods that might be possible, considering pressure-treated pine is so expensive right now. So, love the show and would appreciate any feedback you have. Thanks.
Now, I realize that that is static, maybe a little bit of road noise, as he might be recording that while he's in his car. But since he's calling and asking about a dock, I'd like to think that that's the sound of waves crashing as he's somewhere where the dock needs to go. It's particularly nice ambiance for that particular question. So, interesting here that this is not the first time I've gotten a question where somebody's saying, I understand that pressure treated pine is the best solution here, but it's just so expensive. What are the other solutions? I hate to tell you this, but even though pressure treated pine is still expensive, it's still probably the cheapest solution. Certainly the pressure treated stuff went up dramatically for a while there. Some of that is starting to correct and it's coming back into, quote, normal pricing. I don't think you're ever going to see it return to pre-COVID levels. But while pressure treated went up dramatically, we saw a lot of the other products start to go up. Things like Ipe that I just talked about have also gone up and were majorly on the rise before COVID. So, let's talk about some of the materials. Pressure treated is fine. It's going to require more maintenance sooner. The fact that it's a floating dock and the dock is going to be on pontoons does play in your favor. If this were like put onto pylons stuck into the ground, the pressure treated is going to last not nearly as long as it would in the fact that the pontoons are taking the most of the water and you're just getting kind of splashback and things like that. If you had it in direct contact with water or sunk into the ground like pilings, the de facto species for that is greenheart. And most places where you go and you do see a pier that's actually got pilings into the ground, it is greenheart. And gosh, I think there are several marine construction companies that specialize in greenheart, and many of them will tell you 30 to 40 years on those pilings before they need to replace. Some of them even go longer than that. So I can't remember the latest numbers for pressure treated pine, but most people don't go beyond about 20 years. And then others will tell you, depending upon certain, not for actual in water and ground contact, for like a pressure treated deck, they'll say like 20 years. If it's actually in ground contact, it's much, 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 much less, like 5 years or under for pressure treated pine. But the reason it's kind of the go-to solution is because it is relatively inexpensive compared to all the other products. The other thing is pressure-treated pine is regularly manufactured in thicker cuts than decking boards. Your traditional decking board is going to be 1 inch thick or 3/4 of an inch thick, or in some instances a 2x material for like commercial construction. Pressure treated pine, you can readily find 4x4s and 6x6s and 8x8s, and all kinds of 2x6s, 2x10s, 2x12s, etc. that you'll be using for the framing lumber for the substrate of that dock. And in your case, you'll have the pontoons, but you still need to build a structure on top of those pontoons and have fascia boards and things like that, and joists that you will lay those decking boards on top of. That's going to be 2x, 2x6s, 2x8s, possibly even 2x10s for your fascia boards. You're not going to be able to find that in a lot of other species. So for instance, I just spoke about Ipe and Kumru. Ipe, you can get 2x material pretty relatively easily, but it's expensive. It is really expensive. If you think traditional Ipe decking boards are expensive, start talking about the structure material, the 2x6, 8, 10s, etc., 4x4s and 6x6 posts, all readily available, but very, very expensive. Kumru, on the other hand, not readily available outside of your traditional, 3/4 or 1 inch thick decking board. Your 1x4s, your 1x6s, that's kind of what you get. It is possible to special order, like that little island job I was just talking about. We brought in massive timbers, like 8x8s, 6x6s for that. And those had to be brought in green because no one was drying it. No one was really even sawing it. We had to go direct to a mill in Brazil and have them kind of shut down production for a day and just produce those. It was a very, very specialized order. It's not easy to get Kumru in sizes other than decking boards. And the same thing would apply with any of the other tropical species. Forget about it in Garapa or Tigerwood or Canberra, Masaranduba, any of those species. It's going to be very difficult to get anything but a 1x4 or a 1x6. So when it comes to actually decking your dock, you could use all kinds of different species. You wouldn't have to use pressure treated. And frankly, that's what's going to get the most wear and tear. Certainly, because this is a floating dock, the pontoons are taking the water contact. You could frame the underside with pressure treated pine, and you're probably going to be okay for quite some time because it's not in direct contact with the water. The decking boards, however, are going to take a beating from the sun. They're going to have the unequal moisture differential underneath, constantly in shade, constantly high humidities close to the water, freezing temperatures, baking temperatures on top. As I've said in the past, decking is like the worst thing you can do to wood. So using a good quality and attractive decking wood like Ipe or Kumru would be a good solution. That's also where you can use like your torrefied products. Kebony comes to mind. They get used a lot in docks. Any of the modified woods, you do have to be a little careful. You can't just automatically assume that all modified woods are going to be great for water contact. There are some that are certainly better than others. I've spoke about a product called Lignia before. They actually make a yacht decking product that is much more water resistant than their traditional Lignia product. And there are many companies like that. I just cite Lignia as one example, but Kebony has several products like that as well, where one is better as a marine use than another. So don't just assume because it's thermally modified or torrefied that it's automatically going to be perfect for water contact. Be certain to look it up, look at the manufacturer, ask the manufacturer some questions, or ask your dealer, is this good for marine construction? Because they're not all equally as good for that. If you're going to be using this dock for generations to come, build it right the first time is what I say. Yes, it may be more expensive to use 2x Ipe material to frame it or to use Greenheart material to frame it, but I'll tell you what, it's going to last generations if you do it that way. The additional cost up front might be a little hard to take, but is it really that big of a cost when you think of not having to rebuild or maintain this floating dock for 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years from now? Yeah. I know it's a tough pill to swallow. We all have run into this. It's the whole buy your last tool first thing. Costs a whole lot of money and you could get away with cheaper right now, but will you be replacing it later? And that's really what I always say when it comes to the pressure treated stuff. It can be had cheaper, but now that pressure treated has gotten a lot more expensive, it's still probably the cheapest option, but the gap, the delta between pressure treated and something like 2x Ipe may not be as wide as it was before. And while you'll end up paying more for the Ipe, you won't have to replace it 5 years from now. You'd probably be good 20 or 30 years from now without having to replace it. So something to think about. And I didn't mention locust. I did mention locust in the past. That's another one that could be a good solution for you that certainly you can find it a lot more inexpensively. So if you've got some markets in your neck of the woods for locust, I say check it out. That might be a good option for you. Ethan has an interesting question about saunas. He said, I just listened to your exterior wood episode and was curious about choosing Douglas fir for building a barrel sauna. I know it's probably not ideal, but with wood prices the way they are, I wanted to look into a less expensive wood. I am, however, concerned how the Doug fir would fare with a huge range of temperatures and humidities it would be subjected to. So here's another instance where you're building a sauna. You're expecting this or hoping this to last quite some time. So is saving money on the material the most important thing to consider? Maybe it is. I don't want to, I don't know the specific situation, but 9 times out of 10, when I'm working with my customers, the cost of the wood is a small percentage of the overall cost of the project. Now, when you're doing it yourself, it's a little hard to judge all that, right? Because you're doing all the labor, you're doing all the milling, you're building a barrel sauna, you're cutting all those bevels, you're dealing with all the joinery yourself. If you're a contractor that's maybe buying the parts, you're paying a lot more for the parts because someone has already milled it. And the raw material cost kind of becomes a non-issue once you factor in the cost of all the other labor upstream of that, downstream of that in order to make the parts, and then the actual assembly and joinery, construction, sealing, all the fun stuff that comes with making a sauna like that. If you're doing it yourself, you may not have a cost associated with that other than the labor itself. So the one that's sticking in your mind is the actual price tag on the lumber. But I guarantee you, if you actually started to price out putting, a dollar amount on the time you're putting into this and the other materials and things that you're using to make this sauna, the additional cost from going from something like Douglas fir to Western red cedar or to any of the other, what's the one, why can't I think of it? Spruce, or Finland spruce is one that kind of is almost synonymous with saunas, and the slightly greater price tag on that may not be that big of a percentage change. However, I don't see why Douglas fir wouldn't work. I mean, you want to use a softwood. Hardwoods heat up far too fast and get a lot hotter to the touch in a sauna environment. So pretty much all saunas are going to be made with softwoods because they stay cooler to the touch a lot longer, and you're not going to burn yourself actually going into the sauna. Softwoods, due to the lower density and just the tracheid nature rather than the pore nature of hardwoods, just allows them to handle that massive range of temperatures that you talk about and the humidities you're dealing with. They just have the ability to deal with that stress a lot more than hardwoods. So it's got to be a softwood. Number one choice would be, spruce. Second maybe would be Western red, although some people actually don't like Western red cedar because of the high resin content. It can actually smell, and a lot of people really like that smell, but some people can actually have a reaction to that smell. So keep that in mind. Douglas fir, it doesn't have the more homogeneous texture of spruce or Western red cedar. That stark early to late wood transition that you get might cause a problem, but I really don't think it is. You certainly wouldn't be the first person to use Douglas fir to build a sauna. So yeah, you might ask around, check a couple forums, folks who have built saunas with Douglas fir, if it was a particular issue. I don't really imagine it being much of an issue. But here again, if somebody's telling you overwhelming that spruce is the way to go, how many times in your life are you going to build the sauna? Just like the dock situation, maybe if you're going to build it once, build it right. So price out what the difference might be between the ideal spruce or Western red and the Douglas fir. And I think you might be surprised that you're not going to save that much money on something you're going to build once in a lifetime. So that being said, we've kind of talked around a bunch of different things, but let's talk about how we stretch our wood. How do we make it go further? And again, Zach's question said, what efficiencies have been lost or forgotten in modern processes? And I thought that was particularly interesting because I would think it's the opposite. Back in the past, conservation and efficiency wasn't much of a concern because there was plenty of wood to be had. There wasn't the massive demand for lumber like we have now. You had a lot more cottage industry, village-based wood supply and cabinet maker and joiner. And it wasn't really, if we ran out of wood, there was lots more where that came from. Conservation wasn't even a word. Well, it was a word, but you know what I mean? It wasn't a concern at all. So I think people were much less efficient and much less concerned about stretching their board and making it go further. So I would actually say that modern processes have gotten a hell of a lot better, even than like 50 years ago, 100 years ago. When you look at all those black and white photos of people cutting down massive, massive trees, there was little thought or concern about conservation, about silvicultural, about sustainability. Those were not words in the zeitgeist. Whereas today, conservation, sustainability, environmental concerns, that's everywhere. That's all anybody thinks about. Now, one may make the case that that's all anybody thinks about because of the misdeeds of the past, but I think that just further strengthens this, that, I don't think we've lost or forgotten anything in modern processes. In fact, I think we've gotten a heck of a lot better. So how can we get better? Well, the first thing that comes to mind is we need to loosen our grade requirements. And I'm not saying let's lower the actual grading standards. That's been going on for a long time. And honestly, grades have been lowered not to use more wood, but to make it, how shall I put this politely, to get the same price tag for lesser quality wood. As it became harder and harder to get perfectly clear material, well, you couldn't just do away with the FAS grade and call everything number one common. No, they lowered the grade standards so that number one common was now an acceptable FAS, and you could put the same FAS price tag on number one common. That's really the business there. But as a whole, and I see this a lot in the commercial sector, there are people that are demanding clear all the time. And they don't really understand wood is not a clear material. It's just, certainly there are some species and there are small percentages of woods that are going to be 100% clear. And 100% clear is a relative term, right? Like how big is the part that you need? If you need a 2 foot long by 3 inch wide piece, it's relatively easy to get 100% clear. But if you need a 15 foot run of 6 inch wide crown that has to be 100% clear, that's a totally different standard, totally different specification, well beyond what the grades actually state. FAS being the top grade is only saying a minimum cutting size of 6 inches by 8 inches, and only 83% of that has to be clear. So the grade itself doesn't even come close to the specifications that are being demanded by the commercial sector today. We, as a whole, need to just relax things a little bit. Let's let wood be wood. Knots by NHLA grade is a quote defect, and defect has such a negative stigma to it. But like many of the weekend woodworkers and furniture makers have come to embrace those defects as character and beautiful aspects of wood, and we use them with we desire them, I should say. The perfectly clear stuff doesn't really have a place in the average woodworker's wood shop. And I'm hoping that we're trending that way in the commercial space as well, as we begin to see more, especially in the flooring industry, more rustic grades coming into vogue. Salvaged and rescued barnwood and things like that has become super, super popular. And that stuff is full of defects and full of rot. I mean, there's a product called mushroom wood that is essentially the stuff used in mushroom beds that is rotten wood that's been stabilized using an epoxy and acrylic. This welcoming of defects and embracing the natural characteristics of wood, I hope continues, because the continued demand for 100% clear is just not going to last. And that's really going the opposite direction of stretching our wood, where if you may bring in, say, 30,000 board feet of Western red cedar, and a buyer rejects 60% of that because it's not 100% clear, what happens to the rest of that stuff? 9 times out of 10, it goes somewhere into the back of the mill, the back of the yard, waiting for a customer that can use that, or waiting for a customer with a smaller length or narrower width spec, so you can cut around those defects and get 100% clear. And I'll tell you, a lot of that stuff just ends up languishing in the back of the yard. I see commercial construction, home builders, contractors buying 50, 70, sometimes 90% more wood than they actually need for the project, because they're sorting through and they're defecting out a large volume of material. The worst part is they take that leftover and then they return it to the mill and they actually get their money back, which is just crazy to me. I would never imagine doing that, but that's the way business is. But huge amounts of wood being defected because it's not perfectly clear. And I think we're just asking too much of the wood in general. So that's the first thing. And probably I could just end the show here and say that's the only thing. Cut the wood some slack, people. Wood is not a 100% clear product. If you want 100% clear, manufactured products, acrylics, soapstones, granite, things like that, MDF, that's 100% clear. Plastics, and you look at laminates that have printed, wood printed surfaces on the front. And the reason for that is because you couldn't get, a perfectly clear board. We've also got reconstituted products where they've taken long strips of wood and glued them back together to give you that kind of rift sawn look of white oak, and it's just reconstituted strips, formed together. So yeah, I would say that would be the first thing. Let's let wood be wood, and let's welcome those defects and embrace those defects. Definitely better planning and buying. Like I said before, some people buying 50 to 90% more than what they need. And I think a really good way around that is partner with your lumber yard, partner with your millwork house, and let them take on more of the actual manufacture process. So a lot of companies buy rough sawn wood, and then they take it and they mill it into a product, whether they mill it into siding or they make windows and doors out of it. If you can have the lumber supplier do more of that work for you, or at least have your lumber supplier partnering with your millwork house that's doing the joinery, we can pick and choose. So weekend woodworkers, small shop woodworkers are going to understand this. We'll go and buy some wood, and we spend a lot of time agonizing over grain and color match. And I'm speaking for myself in this situation. It's one of my favorite parts of building furniture is the day I can spend getting the perfect grain and color match, but also maximizing my yield on the boards that I have and taking that time to choose just the right piece and nesting my parts within that particular board, because I'm doing all of it. I'm pulling the board off the rack, I'm selecting the board, or I'm buying the rack from my lumberyard with a specific part or parts in mind. Then I'm cross-cutting it, I'm jointing and I'm milling and all that stuff with particular parts in mind, trying to eke out as much as I can from one board. The best grain and color match you can get in a piece of furniture is by building it out of one board. Obviously, it's not always possible, but you'd be amazed how far you can stretch that one board or a couple of boards to get the best grain and color match. If you're gluing up a tabletop from 6 different boards, it's going to be really hard to get that color match. This same idea of buying with the project in mind and selecting your boards, knowing that you're going to work them all the way through the process. And actually, let me back up and reverse engineering that. Understanding the process, understanding what the finished product is, knowing that I'm going to need a panel that's X wide by X long, and reverse engineering that back to the lumber rack at the lumberyard, and knowing that if I buy one 8-inch wide board, I can get the whole top out of that. But if I buy a 6-inch wide board, then I'm going to have to buy an extra board, and I'm going to have a huge amount of offcut. Maybe I'm going to have a 36-inch offcut or a 48-inch offcut or something like that. So just eking out a little bit more and buying a slightly wider board means that you end up with an 8-inch offcut. You're maximizing your yield there because you understand every step in the process. And this is where things fall apart in the commercial sector, because first of all, there's so many hands in that process. That lumber may get skip planed at the lumberyard, but then it's taken to a millwork house and it's ripped into strips and joinery is cut in it and it's made into window and door frames. And those window and door frames are taken somewhere else to have glass added into them, or then taken from there to a job site, and a trim carpenter is installing them and doing additional work around them. And there's so many different hands in the middle there that, there's so much waste left over. If you are buying, if you are a window shop, and, all of your windows need rails and stiles of around 36 inches. You're working in multiples of 3 feet. Well, if you're buying lumber that is 10 feet long, you're guaranteed you're always going to have at least 1 foot of off-fall. Or, I've seen a lot worse. Maybe you're buying 7-foot boards. Then you've got, this 1 foot of off-fall, or the worst is when you're buying like 5-foot boards and you've got 2 feet of off-fall, or a 6-foot board, and there's no way you can get 2 3-foot boards out of there because the saw curve makes that second board that much shorter, and you end up with these huge amounts of off-fall that is a massive amount of waste. You want to be buying your products, buying your raw lumber with that end product in mind. So that is a tough pill to swallow in the commercial sector when the volume of wood you need in order to produce the volume of windows or doors or siding is massive. It's absolutely massive, and you can't really plan back that far. But here is where having your lumber yard do more of this work for you, because the lumber yard has a massive inventory on the ground of boards in all different lengths and widths. And they know that I need to produce, 100, 1,000 of this part, whatever that is, a rail, a stile, or door panel, whatever. I need to produce 1,000 of those. Well, what's the best way that I can get 1,000 of those? Their off-fall becomes very apparent because it stacks up really, really quickly. And if you're pulling 20 boards off the shelf to get 4 parts, and you see this massive stack of off-fall piling up that you can't do anything with, you quickly correct that and you start pulling your boards differently in order to get a better product. That's a massive thing that I can see, a better line of sight into the finished product, and keeping that in mind all the way back to selecting your boards, and if possible, all the way back to selecting your logs. This is a very rare thing in the commercial lumber industry, as very few companies are the importer of record as well as the millwork house. There's usually an importer of record. They bring in the logs, they bring in the boards, and then that's handed off to someone else. So it happens the company I work for does do literally stump to finished product, but that is a very rare thing. But it allows us to pay very close attention. If the specification is for a super, super wide board, and we know that that's not just possible, maybe we value engineer it for a different species, or we go direct to the concession and say, this is really what we need. Let's log accordingly so that we don't have massive amounts of waste. Or in some instances, it's just not possible to get that spec unless you go all the way back to the log and you choose the actual trees to be felled to meet that particular spec. That is pie in the sky and very, very rare. To be honest, it's also very, very expensive. It's like a special order times a special order times a special order. But the point remains, if you know the full line of sight into that process. I wrote an article for Popular Woodworking years ago about going to the lumber yard with a plan A and a plan B. If you are actually going to be making that finished product, you should have a very clear understanding of the most efficient board or boards to produce whatever it is you're making. And if you don't, and you're just buying off volume, i.e. board feet, you're going to end up with a lot of waste and you're not going to stretch that very far. So if possible, focus on that one board, one project approach. It's not always going to be possible, but if you have that in mind and you're constantly thinking about how do I get everything I need out of this one board? And then, okay, I got, 9 of the 16 parts that I need out of this one board. Can I get the remainder, what did I say, 9 out of 16? The remaining 7 parts from the other board. And if not, what size board do I need in order to get the remaining 7 parts out of it? Minimizing the off fall as much as possible. That's the number one way that I can say to stretch your wood further. But I want to throw that back to you guys. How do you approach buying your lumber? How do you approach stretching your board dollar further and further and further? This is something that I think we all need to take a long look at our lumber racks, and more importantly, our scrap piles. That scrap pile continues to grow and grow and grow, and you're like, man, what am I going to do with all this scrap? Maybe you're not buying efficiently. You could just be throwing money out. And we're all thinking, well, I'll have a need for that 8-inch scrap one day. But the fact of the matter is you may not. And that 8 inches with these lumber prices today, that could be $20. That's just sitting there in a bin somewhere. So I urge you to think twice about your buying. And I really would love to hear from you guys on how you maximize your board foot dollar, how you stretch your boards to go further. Do you resaw everything? Do you use a lot of veneer? All kinds of different ways you could think of to stretch that out a lot further. So great question, Zach. I do appreciate that. And as I said, I don't have all the answers for this. There's probably 1,000 answers to this, and it's all going to be very specific upon your particular situation and what it is you're making. But it's I think, kind of a rhetorical question that we should all be asking ourselves, because lumber's not getting any cheaper. And while it does grow on trees, it is a limited resource that we need to take very good care of. So think about that. How can you stretch your boards further? And I'd love to hear what success you've had doing that. So let me know. So as always, guys, if you have questions, if you've got feedback, if you've got something you saw on the web and you thought, this could be good for the Lumber Update, send them my way. You can send them to lumberupdate@gmail.com. You can hit me up at Instagram. That's Lumber Update on Instagram, or just go to lumberupdate.com. There's a comment form you can fill out there. Love to hear your feedback, your input, anything. It keeps the show going, and it keeps me on my toes with some of these varied topics like we had today. So thanks as always, guys, and go buy some lumber, but be smart about it so you can minimize your off fall.